Welcome to our book launch of The Global Scholar, Implications for Postgraduate Studies and Supervision. We'd especially like to welcome our attendees from South Africa and from other countries. I know we have people attending from the UK and from Australia. Wherever you are, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the authors of the chapters in the book who've joined us today. We know we have some authors from the USA who would have liked to join us, but it's about 3 a.m. there. So we are recording the launch and we'll make it available to everyone. I would also like to welcome Professor Sioux McKenna from Rhodes University, one of our authors, who will be joining me in conversation about the book a bit later. I'd like to welcome and acknowledge my co-editors, Emeritus Professor Ellie Bitzer and Professor Liesl Frick, who's also the Director of the Center for Higher and Adult Education at Stellenbosch University. Thank you for accompanying me in the process of editing the book, which was not always easy given the circumstances of COVID-19 and lockdown. I really appreciate your support and guidance during the process and your always tactful prompts when I needed some prodding. It's the first time I've edited a book through to publication, and I've learned so much from you in the process. So thank you to Ellie and Liesl. And Liesl will also give us a few words at the end of the webinar. I'd also like just to thank the staff of African Sun Media for their efficient, courteous, and encouraging support during the process of publication. Thank you especially to Anina Joubert, who's here with us today, and Vickers van Zyl for their kind and professional engagement. Just to give you an idea of what we'll be doing in today's webinar, I'll start by giving you a brief overview of the book. And then we'll go on to have a conversation between me and Sioux McKenna, where we'll just talk a bit about the book and some of the issues and questions arising from the topic of the book. And then we'll conclude with Liesl Frick giving us conclusion and some thanks. Right, so let's go straight into it. I'll just like to give you an overview of the book and tell you a bit about the contents and the organization of the book. The book came out of our 2019 conference on postgraduate supervision, which was here at Wine Estate. It includes chapters based on the keynote addresses at the conference, as well as chapters based on some of the best contributions at the conference. So the title and the focus of the book, the Global Scholar, is particularly appropriate at this time when we are rethinking the idea of the global, what we share as a species with other species. It's come under renewed scrutiny with COVID-19. I think it's interesting that COVID came along during the process of developing the book. You know, when we started, there was no pandemic, but it hit us during the publication process, and it had a very powerful impact both on the process and on our thinking about what the global scholar means and what the global means and how it relates to the local, especially in relation to the academy. So I think this has been something that shaped us and made us think again about the global. The pandemic can be seen as a byproduct of our unprecedented connectedness as a global community through travel and migration, as well as a reflection of our impact on the natural environment and on other species. I think never before have we been so aware of how we are connected, even in the physical isolation of successive lockdowns and travel restrictions. Given this context of global connectedness, the book is divided into 4 sections. The first one is called Horizons. The second one is Currents and Currencies. The third one is trajectories. And then there's a concluding chapter which provides some reflections and directions. I'll just talk briefly about each of those sections, what it's about, and some of the highlights within the chapters of that section. The first section is called Horizons, and this draws on Hans-Georg Gadamer's idea of horizons as what he calls the range of vision that includes everything that can be seen from a particular standpoint. Gadamer developed this idea of horizons within the context of hermeneutical theory. In other words, within the context of understanding texts and what we bring to our understanding of texts and how we relate from our position to the position of the author and the context of the text. Now, I thought this was a really useful concept to use for our book because we had a number of horizons that in our chapters that presented a particular view of the global scholar. These included a chapter by Maresi Nirad from the United States. She was looking at doctoral students' study abroad experiences, which was a really interesting lens for thinking about the global scholar and recent developments within higher education on the global stage. Then another chapter by Liesel Frick and Johan Mouton provides the horizon from the perspective of the higher education literature. Their literature review on doctoral education as a field of scholarship provides a really useful lens for understanding the global landscape in the field. Pierre Lamberti and Moira Keane look at the Vitae Researcher Development Framework. This provides another kind of horizon of a framework which was developed in the United Kingdom, but which has been used in a number of other contexts. And they bring a critical lens to thinking about the relevance of the framework in a South African context, especially given the moments of fees must fall and decolonizing the curriculum. The unequal relations within global higher education makes us think about how we borrow and recontextualize scholarship and instruments from other contexts. Finally, in this section, Margaret Kiley looks at benchmarking of thesis examinations. Now, the doctoral thesis is probably a really key shared qualification across the globe, and how we benchmark and assess theses also sheds light onto what we share as a global academic community. So that's the first section on horizons. The book then goes on to look at currents and currencies. This is also a very suggestive concept because it has a lot of different connotations. So currency could mean something like academic exchange value. If you think of the doctorate, it's often something that is recognized in different contexts. So it has that exchange value. But currency also links to the idea of currents and moving mobility. It also has the connotation of something that is of immediate relevance, so something that is current. And then finally, intellectual charge, like an electrical charge as a current. So the chapters in this section all touch on one or more of these kinds of currents or currencies. They include Sioux McKenna's chapter, where she looks at the politics of postgraduate education and suggests some ideas about how we should be and do as academics within the space in our doctoral supervision and our teaching of doctoral students, and in the way that we relate the global and the local. Two of the chapters in this section look at the issue of mobility, which has been so drastically affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The chapters by Kelly Duran and Anna Mozaroff look at mobility, bringing in some theoretical insights. And then Rebecca Smith-McGloin from a UK context looks at overseas students and the kinds of factors that affect their experiences of academic mobility. There's also a chapter on doctoral standards in this section. And I think this is one of the most interesting chapters in the book because it compares processes of developing doctoral standards in 3 different contexts. That is the context of Europe, East Africa, and South Africa. And the authors there consider ideas about the similarities and differences of these standards and what it means to develop standards for the doctorate in different contexts. Jan Botha, Mark Wild, Mike Curia, and Murat Ozgoran worked on this chapter. And I think just achieving a collaborative chapter like this was a great achievement. The third section is on trajectories. And here we mean the movement of individuals on particular pathways or courses through their career. So it's related to the idea of mobility, but it's more about individuals or groups of people and how they move through a career. And here we have a number of chapters. Carrie Holly looks at the interdisciplinary PhD in the US context and how students move through that interdisciplinarity and how it affects their studies and their career directions. A very interesting chapter by Roxana Chiapa from the Chilean context looks at the trajectories of doctoral students who've studied abroad and how they find jobs back in their home country at academic institutions. She looks at the factors that influence that, and that gives a sense of the broader context and how it shapes trajectories. Sharon Clarence's chapter on emotion in postgraduate education is a key contribution and very relevant in our current context, where the pandemic has exacerbated aspects of affect in students' engagement in postgraduate studies. Finally, Gina Viska and Josh Leshem, Gillian Robinson look at working together beyond the PhD and the different trajectories, both positive and negative, that might take. The book concludes with a chapter on reflections on COVID-19 and how that affects postgraduate studies and supervision. Right, so that's just to give you an overall view of what the book looks like and the kind of shape of the book. I think what's interesting about the book is that we have chapters from South African authors and international authors in all of those sections. So there's a kind of a dialogue that goes on between different contexts within these sections and also across the different themes, which makes for a really interesting read. Right, so I'll leave it there and invite you to continue your exploration. Just before I go on to have a conversation with Sue about this, I just wanted to mention that you will receive a notification from the publishers about where you can get hold of the book. I know it's available on Amazon and Take-A-Lot. And just to mention that the print book is 330 Rand and the ebook is 265 Rand. So you can follow that up as you wish. Right, I'm just going to shift here now and move on to a conversation with Sioux McKenna. Sue was one of our keynote speakers at the conference, and a very striking conference presentation, which challenged the way academics operate within institutions that are often dominated by managerialist and neoliberal ways of thinking. And so Sue's chapter is a really important contribution in our book. And so I welcome her here to our webinar. And I'm just going to have a conversation around some questions related to the book. And you're welcome to post comments if you'd like us to address particular questions or comments that you raise. So welcome, Sue. Let me just find my notes. Now, we had a conversation about the questions and what we should talk about today. But I just wanted to start off by asking you, in what ways, if any, do you see yourself as a global scholar? And do you think that this is part of every scholar's identity in our globalized world?
Thanks. Yes, I think it definitely is part of every global scholar's identity in this globalized world order, whether the scholar knows it or not. And I think therein lies the rub, because if we're not alert to the ways in which global forces are shaping our universities, our academic identities, our work, our student experiences, if we're not aware of the global forces conditioning of those realities, then I think it's possible that we might not be alert to where the global forces are constraints rather than affordances. So I think we do need to be critically reflective of the ways in which higher education in South Africa or Sweden or Suriname or wherever you are being conditioned by global forces. So in many ways, I think it's just important to pause and to make sense of what that means in your context. Because, I mean, of course, the new global world order is a boon to knowledge creation. You know, we can learn about research happening in another part of the world within seconds of it happening. But of course, it's also been the means by which geographic power differences have been kind of reinstated at the end of colonialism. They've been reinstated through this sort of global world order. And I mean, I think the politics of academic publishing and citation patterns are just one example of globalization as a constraining force on academia. If you want to increase your H index, then you should co-author with someone from the global north. You should publish in global north publications. And I think that relates to that economic understanding of currency of academia that you mentioned just now, and that you, Liesl, and Ellie referred to in the introduction of the book. But being a global scholar who pays attention to how these forces play out, regardless of whether we're working in the global north or global south, I think allows us to make decisions on the basis of the common good and to make choices that are informed by social justice considerations for the planet as a whole. As to your question about how I see myself as a global scholar, I think in the obvious ways, I think I've been very, very privileged to be able to work on various projects with people from countries around the world and benefited from their inputs and their connections. But I'm increasingly starting to understand the idea of a global scholar in a bit of a less obvious way. I think we've all been fed this diet of knowledge produced almost entirely in the global north and underpinned by neoliberal notions of the economization of knowledge. And so somewhat ironically, I think I am beginning to understand my role as a global scholar as framed by the need to better understand local knowledge and to look to the global south for explanations of the phenomena that I research.
Thanks, Sue. Now, I was just thinking about these global forces. It often seems that they are so huge and powerful that you could just see yourself as a kind of a pawn who is simply perpetuating the unequal and oppressive relations of globalization. But from what you've been saying, it seems that you're saying that academics do have agency and can make a difference. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that. I mean, how can academics who are, are limited to a particular local context, how can they make a difference within this, within the context of globalization and neoliberalism? Yeah.
Well, as I said, I do think globalization is ubiquitous. It's in every sphere of society, and it's certainly very, very true in higher education. And I think you're right. When I say that we should pause and make sense of how those forces affect our context, it can feel perhaps overwhelming and disempowering. But of course, firstly, it's really important, I think, that we hold on to the benefits, the affordances of this idea, that we can, share ideas, we can make sense of our context by considering other contexts and so on and so forth. But we also, the agency, I think, comes in our criticality as to how those global forces are implemented within our context. So, for example, I think every country now has almost exactly the same quality assurance regime. Almost every country has qualifications frameworks, and those few countries that do not are in the process of spending a whole lot of money to develop them. And regardless of where we might stand on issues like impact factors and rankings and predatory publications, regardless of where we stand, and we're all having conversations about them, whatever country we're in, whatever university we're in. And so, so it is ubiquitous, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. The issue is simply that we need to think about what it means in our context and to use our agency to push back. At the same time that these forces are coming so strongly into play, we find concomitant development of what the literature calls managerialism, which is where sort of all academics need to be managed at all times. We should not trust academics where they need to be managed, and they need to have quite clear processes to check that they are on track and doing their work. And so that probably more than these big global forces reduces agency. And that's where I think academics need to speak out. Academics, and it's not, we're not fighting these big invisible forces. We're looking at this policy serving its Senate on this day. So I think, you mentioned this in your introductory comments today and in the final chapter of the book. You speak about how, as the pandemic has slowed global travel and in many ways prevented us connecting with each other. Gosh, remember the conference at Spear? It seems like another world. But ironically, as the pandemic has led to physical distancing, it's also, as you said, really highlighted how interconnected the world is, because there can't be an individual solution to this virus. There can't even be a national solution to this virus. It has to be a global one. And I think in much the same way, it's going to take global scholars across the planet to address some of the problems that are in the higher education sector. We all need to come together as scholars, and that, the extent of your agency may feel quite limited, but we all have agency, whether it's how we interact with our students, how we comment on a policy. We all need to come together as scholars and make an international commitment to higher education as serving people and the planet. And I think here in particular about the way in which UNESCO positions education as a global common good. And I think all three of those words are so important, a global common good. So I think being a global scholar entails committing to this notion of higher education as a global common good and trying to live this out in whatever little corner we are in.
Thanks very much. I think that's one of the things that struck me about your chapter and your conference presentation was how you were talking about relationships, the relationships between colleagues, between supervisors and students, and how that our agency can also be important in the way that we interact with each other. I wonder if you'd like to just elaborate a bit on that, because now we often think about the academic life as about the intellect, about our intellectual contribution. But I found your emphasis on relationships and interaction with people very powerful. And I'd like to just ask you about, how do you see the relationships within, especially supervision relationships within this global context?
Well, I mean, that's, I guess, where agency gets enacted. It's through our actual relationships with the knowledge object or the policy, or indeed with our students and with our colleagues. And I think in many ways, the current way, because it's a global order and because universities are increasingly kind of being managed to, I mean, the rankings came out yesterday, so we're regularly being pitted against each other. And I think that within our universities, we kind of get positioned as these individualistic people, so that it can even be difficult to genuinely celebrate a colleague's success, because there's an immediate reaction. And I know this is not just me, because I've spoken to lots of other people. They're sort of like, oh, sure, but, they've done this. I haven't done that yet, So we kind of pitted as these competitive beings. And I think that's where relationships, I think a lot of the literature looks at the relationship between supervisors and students with good reason, because there's a built-in power differential, and it's not always a problematic one, because why does the student need a supervisor? It's because they want someone with experience of the process of knowledge creation, of the phenomenon, of the methodology, and so on. But it's toxic if that becomes a way that prevents the student from achieving their best possible identity, knowledge creation identity. If that relationship makes them feel undermined or stupid or unworthy, or that they are imposters, then it's problematic. But I think what's really interesting, and perhaps hasn't been looked at enough in the literature, is the relationship between supervisors. And the way in which are we supporting each other. And I love the chapter, I think it's Kelly Guerin's chapter, about the sort of the need for collaborative spaces in the postgraduate education environment. And I think we need to talk and think about how we care for each other, how we support each other. And this is not about being nice, it's not about being uncritical. It can be about being very critical, but how do we make sure we do this in a way that is genuinely supportive of our colleagues and of the knowledge endeavor? Something interesting that's happened, I don't know if you've experienced this in your work, Peter, but since the pandemic started, and I would say this year even more than last year, I have had more mental health issues with both students and colleagues than I've ever had before. And I'm also finding more kind of, I don't want to call them spats, because that undermines the emotions embedded in them, but I'm having to deal with far more, people not being supportive of each other. I think that we are worn quite thin. I think we all have been scared for quite a long time, and it's starting to show. And so, when we talk about working for the common good and social justice, these feel like enormous projects. But what they come down to is, when we are engaging with each other, are we making space for each other? Are we helping each other? Are we pulling up people? If we've stepped a step up a ladder, or that's a horrible analogy, but if we've managed to succeed in some place, do we pause and think, okay, now how did I get here, and how can I make it easier for others? So I completely forgot what your question was.
No, I think you have, the question was about relationships, and I think you certainly have addressed that. Thank you very much, Sue. I was thinking about how the pressure on academics to produce both scholarship and master's graduates and PhD graduates, and the pipeline. It's interesting how we use these industrial metaphors, throughput and output and all of those kinds of terms. And as you said, the pandemic has affected people's health their outlooks. So relationships become even more crucial. And I think that in that light, Sharon Clarence's chapter about emotion in postgraduate study is so important. How we accommodate and recognize the way students are feeling in the supervision relationship, I think is really important. And I know that perhaps traditionally people have said, no, we must keep your emotions out of it, keep your life. This is, you're a student, it's about your intellect and your achievement. But I think we need to move to a more holistic understanding that emotions do affect cognition, actually. That our cognitions are embodied, and that includes our emotions. And so for me, the pandemic has helped me to understand that better in relation to my own students, and I think myself, as a supervisor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking there are two things that jump to mind as you say that. And the one is that that it's been very interesting to watch publications in the last 2 years. So there, in 2020, there was this huge increase in publications around the world, which is perhaps counterintuitive, but maybe it's obvious because people were at home and perhaps, but the interesting thing is, of course, how uneven it was. So it was, we definitely see, and I've just looked at analysis of the Springer Journal's 2020 outputs, and we saw a huge jump mainly amongst men. And that speaks to, I think, the fact that our students are whole people, and our students who may be working in a very gendered environment. Under the pandemic, women were being expected to take on extra burdens of childcare and parent care and whatever else it may be, perhaps, than what they would have normally done. So, I mean, we always have this disparity in terms of publication of more men than women, perhaps not quite as bad in education journals. But in fact, definitely not as bad in education journals. But if we look across the disciplines, and that was exacerbated under 2020. So I think that's one thing that your comments made me think of, is that people are social beings. They are within family context, within responsibilities, and so on. But the other thing is, of course, that this is part of the decolonial project, isn't it? Is to acknowledge the extent to which our knowledge is not objective. Now, I certainly am not a sort of relativist, all knowledges are lovely and anything goes kind of person. I think some knowledges are principled and powerful, and students should have access to those knowledges. But I think the extent to which we've had this sort of Cartesian divide between, emotion and the mind and the body, it's hugely problematic. Sharon's chapter indeed addresses that, but it's not only problematic in terms of how we get on with our students and our colleagues, it's also problematic in terms of how we understand knowledge. And so I think we've long understood knowledge as potentially objective. And yeah, and that has allowed so much racism and sexism to continue in the academy, because we've pretended, we've all agreed to this farce of pretending that knowledge is neutral and objective. And so how can it be implicated in racism and sexism? So yeah, I think that the pandemic has opened the door to rethinking so much, but we have to grab that opportunity.
Thank you. And I just want to thank also comments coming from Yvonne, Maureen, Juliet. Thanks very much. And I think, one of the things they've raised is this issue around the relation between the local and the global, and pointing out that, northern contexts are also local contexts, and that often, in the literature, there's an assumption of a kind of universality in finding, say, North America or in Europe. So there's almost this elision between the local and the global in terms of knowledge, as you were saying, that certain local knowledges become powerful, almost global knowledges. And as people in the South, we are dealing with this knowledge economy, if I can put it like that. And I wonder if you could comment on, that relation between the local and the global in higher education. How do we negotiate those tensions within our supervision and our teaching? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think those tensions are everywhere. And again, it probably sounds self-evident, but the most important thing is for us to reflect on them, because so often the power of tensions is that they're not articulated. So we need to pause. I keep saying pause, but I think that's the biggest problem with the sort of performance management regime, is that there isn't time to pause. Pausing, reflecting, and reading. If we're going to have workloads and performance management, can we please allow a massive percentage of academics' time to be pause, reflect, read? But somehow that doesn't seem to feature. But I think that those tensions are everywhere, and we really do need to think about them. I mean, I think if particular research questions are consistently prioritized over others, if particular approaches are foregrounded as the norm in a particular area of research and others are ignored, if certain researchers get supported and others are neglected, then we're missing out as a planet, aren't we? Because there's a whole wealth of potential solutions, answers, understandings that we're not tapping into because of, as you say, this kind of notion of genericism. And a notion of, and we see it in teaching and learning research, and including postgraduate supervision research, a sort of idea of that there is a thing called best practice, and it's a global best practice, and of course I'm pleased to see, that there's so many people in the room and in this book who push back at some of those kind of ideas. I think that focusing on the local can mean contributing to the global. It can mean, especially because, our publications can be read around the world. So really honing in on the local is important. I mean, there are two examples that I can give to try and make this sound a little bit more concrete. I mean, the one is the extent to which reviewers and examiners and higher degrees committees want the place of the research to be named in the title and the research question. Now, this is just anecdotal, and it's something I really should research. But I first noticed it when I was sitting in a higher degrees committee, and it was at the title was something like, studying mathematics, some kind of mathematical pedagogical intervention in early or whatever, in grade 2 learners. And someone said, oh, but it's in Namibia, it must say in Namibia. And I thought, now why does it have to, obviously it would explain the context in the proposal, but why must it say in Namibia in the research question and in the title? And I thought it's exactly the same way. And I've had this with reviews, is that they say, oh, but you must say in South Africa in the title. We wouldn't have to say that if it's in the United Kingdom or in the USA. So there is this problem where certain knowledge in certain areas is seen to, you can express it in a decontextualized way, even though that's not what the authors might intend doing. So,
yes.
So I
think really interesting.
That's one example. But the other example was something that I've been looking at recently, and that is about calls for funding. This is not actually about research. This is about teaching and learning development. But if I have a look at the big calls for funding from the global north to the global south, if you have an analysis of some of these, you'll see that there's a big call, just as the World Bank used to only fund competency-based education initiatives in Africa. So for a long time, that has been okay, let's make it competency-based. And now I see the similar thing coming out with in a slightly different format, where it's talking about practical knowledge. So they will fund practical knowledge for practical solutions. Now that's great. Hey, you're offering us money and we can identify a local practical problem and identify a solution. That's great. But funding that's offered in the global north includes a lot of blue sky abstract research. So there's this weird thing that research in the Global South should be practical. So, because let's face it, we're riddled with problems and we must fix the problems. But of course, blue sky research, abstract research is often at the forefront of moving a field forward, of moving a discipline forward. So if Global South research needs to be very practical to get funding, and Global North research can be a broader spectrum, then again, we're reinforcing these divides. So yeah, those are just two examples, I think, of the ways in which we can, perhaps without much thought, reinforce the idea of difference across countries.
Sue, I know you've been looking at the chapters in our book, and given our conversation now, what do you think is the main contributions of the book within higher education and debates about supervision and postgraduate teaching?
I really loved the range of the book in geographic terms. So I think, as I've said, as you've said, I think as global scholars, we need to be reading across contexts. And it's not to say that someone else's context has no bearing on our context. We can learn, but I think it's really important that we do that we do read across contexts. You can almost have diffractive reading in this book. You can almost use one chapter's reading to read another chapter so that they can kind of work in conversation. I think the book really allows us to do this. I loved the fact that the book has a combination of a focus on the very much up close and personal, as you said, a lot of focus on relationships, focus on the need for collaborative spaces for postgraduate students, focus on the emotions in doctoral studies and postgraduate studies. But then there's also this focus on the bigger mechanisms, the role of the chapter on transdisciplinarity, the chapter, Rox's chapter on the sort of challenging this idea of the university as a meritocracy, where these postgraduate and doctoral, in her case was doctoral students, can equally participate in network building. And I thought that the critical account of international benchmarking was really well worth engaging. And of course, the chapter, Liesl and Johan's chapter, that outlines the existing literature. And that makes a strong case, actually, for the book, because it points out a sort of almost a complete absence. Not a complete absence, but almost a complete absence of substantial Africa-wide scholarship on doctoral supervision. So a number of chapters in the book address that issue. And I have to say, I thought your introduction was really great. Typically in a book like this, I think the introduction is kind of just an overview of the chapters, whereas in this case, it actually provided real food for thought. And there were a couple of the concepts that especially the concept of currency, that I think, oh, I really want to read more on that and take that up more. I did think about pulling out a few of my favorite chapters to talk about, but then I decided that would probably say more about my personal interests than anything else. And a not unimportant issue is that this book is really affordable. And I think that is a massive consideration given the politics of academic publishing. I think that's so I'm really glad. I think you gave the price in rands. What was it, like 300 Rand and 300 something Rand in a hard copy and 200 something Rand, and I mean you put that into dollars and it's laughable. And I think that's important. That's really, really important if we want to talk about education being a common good. That's part of it.
Thanks very much, Sue. We've got a few minutes, and what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is and we talked about that could you read a short excerpt from your chapter, and then perhaps just tell us something about why you think it's important. Would that be okay? I just want to give the attendees a taste of, a bit of the book. So if you wouldn't mind.
Well, then I hope I've selected a good paragraph. But anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as you said, my chapter is an attempt to illustrate the pervasiveness of human capital theory as an explanation for postgraduate studies and its stranglehold on how we think about the purpose and the function and the process of postgraduate education. But it also includes a set of 5 lessons that I am personally trying to learn in my own supervision practice. And so I'm going to share one of those lessons here. It's a lesson about the need for supervisors to be vulnerable and to show their vulnerability to their students. And I think it's important to me because of the sort of hyper-competitive nature of the university environment, where failure seems so shameful that you can't confess to failure or seek help, or it pushes us to always put on our best face, and I think that can be at the cost to our own well-being. So this is the lesson. It's be vulnerable. I would urge us to demonstrate to those around us that not everything that counts can be counted. We have to make explicit to our postgraduate students that those things that can and do count, even if our systems fail to count them. We have to show the pleasure of taking intellectual risks. We have to demonstrate how we expect failure to happen, and sometimes even welcome failure for the lessons it provides. We need to be vulnerable and open to these failures. Berg and Sieber speak of the shadow CV, the resume that includes the list of rejected articles and unsuccessful grant applications. If the postgraduate scholars we are welcoming into the discipline see only our successes, no wonder they feel overwhelmed by their own failures. It is only when those of us with workplace security and institutional influence behave in ways of compassion and vulnerability that novice academics and students will see that it is okay for them to be fully human too. Thanks, Peter.
Wow, thanks so much, Sue. As you were reading, I was thinking about adult learning theory. My field is adult education, and how the notion of failure, or what Mezirow calls a disorienting dilemma, and Peter Jarvis calls it a disjuncture. How often it's that kind of moment of disorientation, which can be linked to a failure or a change in life circumstances, is often a key moment in a person's learning and in their lifelong learning, and can be a transformative moment. And yet, as you're saying, we are so ashamed of failure that we suppress it and try to hide it. And yet, if we look at our own lives, often it is those moments that have been key to the way we've grown and developed. So I really appreciate that thought. Thank you very much for that. I think we moving towards a conclusion now. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite Professor Liesl Frick, who's the director of our center, if she would like to just make some concluding remarks. Welcome, Liesl, and I'll hand over to you now.
Good morning, everyone, and it is absolutely wonderful to see you all, or to hear you all, at least see you here. I have been very fortunate to be part of this sort of intellectual project of this book, and I would like to, before I end off, I would like to start off by really thanking firstly the co-editors, Yili and Peter, for their commitment and their hard work. I think the way in which this book has come together has really sort of cemented the idea for me that, collaboration is so much more enjoyable than competition for me personally. And I really enjoy working on these kind of book projects together with people such as yourself, and also, of course, all the co-authors. And I agree with Sue that, not just the geographical distribution, but also the diversity of thinking and about this issue of postgraduate supervision that is encapsulated within this book is really exciting for me. So thank you to each one of you who have contributed, and I hope that those of you who haven't seen or read the book will acquire it and really contribute to the conversation going forward. And so talking about going forward, I have got the privilege to announce to all of you that we will be hosting the 8th Postgraduate Supervision Conference in 2022. Now, the pandemic has really sort of wreaked havoc with our collaborations in meaningful ways as well. And I think the kind of conversations that I've been having over the past couple of months have really showed me that those kind of collegial connections are so important. And so when we planned, we really struggled with the idea of whether we would be able to host a face-to-face conference, which is, to my mind, so important for us to be able to connect in meaningful ways with each other. But given the current situation and the volatility and uncertainty around travel regulations, we decided to host the conference in a virtual or online format. And I'm hoping that there will also be positives around this. As Sue and Peter's conversation has highlighted, it's not just, a negative thing. And one that I am looking forward to, for one, is to add new voices to our conversation in this way, because I realize that it's not always travel to and from conferences is truly a privilege. I think that's what the pandemic has really taught me. And not everyone has that privilege. But I'm hoping that in an online format, we can add new and interesting voices to the conversation in meaningful ways that is more inclusionary, in that we can include people that otherwise wouldn't be able to travel to Stellenbosch and join us for these conversations. The theme for the conference will be transitions, trajectories, and transformations in postgraduate supervision. The times they are changing. I think not many of us can argue against that. So I think it opens up an interesting space for conversations about where are we coming from, where are we moving to, both as supervisors, as students, as systems, as institutions. And it is really sort of a theme that, for me at least, opens a lot of spaces for the conversations that you'll find in this book to continue. And I'm hoping to see all of you that are attending this session there. And I've had some conversations over the past couple of weeks with a number of colleagues who are attempting to submit abstracts. And I'm very enthused by what I'm hearing on the ground and through the grapevine about the kinds of contributions that we're expecting to receive. I'm really looking forward to hearing these papers. And I'm hoping that we'll see all of you, and including some really interesting people from around the world, to join us for this event. I know that the deadline for submission for abstracts is the 27th of September, and you can go to our webpage for our Centre for Higher and Adult Education, CHHE, at sun.ac.za/conference, and go and look at how we've outlined the different themes under the main theme for the conference, as well as what the deadlines are. So thank you very much for this opportunity to join in the conversation. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation, and that it shouldn't end here and with this book. So I think the book creates a useful platform for us to build on what we have. I have to also especially thank Sue, not only for delivering one of the most excellent keynotes I've ever heard at the conference, but also contributing a chapter and to today's conversation about the book. I'm truly grateful for your time, your willingness to share your insights, as always, your generous scholarship. It does not go unseen, and I think you really practice what you preach in terms of the chapter that you've outlined for us as well. So thank you so much, Sue. Thank you, Peter, for leading this conversation. I'm really looking forward. I agree with Sue that the first chapter is a really interesting contribution to the book, and it's truly sort of Peter's brainchild, and I want to recognize that. And I think I've worked on a couple of books, and this is one that has been really enjoyable in that way as well. So thank you, everyone. I hope you stay safe, you stay healthy. If you're in the Western Cape, stay warm. And thank you very much, Peter, for including me in the conversation. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Liesl. And thank you to everyone who attended today. We really appreciate your time, and we hope that you've found our discussion interesting, and that you'll engage with our future conference and with the book. So goodbye to everybody. Have a good day and a good weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.